And welcome one and all to the Find the Fabulous Humiliation Corner, where, as I promised in State of Indie, I am now going to look back at some of my old predictions. These are the ones that appeared in the SOI articles pre-YouTube 2021 and 2022. I will have links to those in the description if you want to read those and see all of the predictions I made that should have come true by now. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them because some of them are just kind of weird and offbeat and they don't really make sense so much anymore. I'm going to focus on the ones that were either a hair off of the bullseye or that didn't even hit the board. And speaking of predictions that didn't even hit the board, let's start with a Sign of the Times prediction from 2021. This is actually the very first one on there. As more media companies move into the gaming space, there will be an increasing need for games to fill out streaming and download libraries. Many small developers will attempt to attract the attention of these companies by maximizing short-term sales and visibility, such as by offering their games at rock-bottom prices or for free. However, the profit gained by working with these companies will be insignificant for the foreseeable future. So hey guys, remember back when Netflix was going to challenge Valve and replace Steam as the major PC platform? Remember back when game streaming was the big thing and everyone was really psyched about Google Stadia? You remember that? It was only a couple of years ago. It wasn't that long ago. I'm always kind of in awe, not just in the video game space, but anywhere. This is something I see all the time in writing, where people will say shit like, well, I realized that I haven't really been involved in the last 5 or 6 years, but come on, how much could possibly change in 5 years? Everything can change in 5 years. Everything can change. Like, we are currently living in a media environment that is incredibly unstable. And as little as like 2 or 3 years is enough for everything to get turned completely upside down. Flashback to when I wrote that in 2021, you did have, well, Google Stadia, but you also had Netflix acquiring a bunch of little studios. You had stuff like Metal Luna, I think it was called. All these companies were starting up these little either game development or game distribution outfits. That was the big deal thing of 2021, because at the time, video games, including indies, were seen as this real growth area, and there's venture capital pouring in, like everybody was trying to get a piece. And then the following year, I wrote the following. More non-video game companies will enter the video game space either on the development or distribution side. These companies will draw in an ever larger share of small development teams, but will also see some teams created from the remnants of dead studios and even brand new teams created from scratch. This will draw in many teams and individuals who don't want to work with the growing AAA behemoths, but the results will be mixed at best, and most of these companies will end up withdrawing from video games, having achieved very little. When assessing these predictions, I'm not sure if these ones are wrong or just moot. Because, Stadia aside, as far as I can tell, a lot of these, like, game distribution, game streaming, whatever, brands, I guess you'd call them, they still exist. It's just that they now exist as tiny, insignificant parts of giant companies. Parts of these companies that nobody talks about anymore. Because 2021, video games were this big growth area. By 2023, everyone had kind of realized that it was overhyped and everybody was pulling the money back. Venture capital was gone. It was seen as too risky. There were too many failures. And, these days, obviously, everyone, the only area where there's any VC growth is in quote unquote AI. And we'll see if that's still around in 2028. I have a feeling it won't be, but I'm not going to make a prediction about that. The current media environment is so unstable that making any predictions, whether it's for the next 2 years or the next 20 or the next 50 or whatever, is a fool's errand. And some cynical people might say that as embarrassing as looking back at my old predictions is for me, it's probably a safer bet than trying to make new ones. And they'd be right. Like, I am not even going to attempt to guess what the video game space or the world or anything else is going to look like in 2028, because I have no fucking clue. Moving out of the world of big business and into a realm where I arguably know something, here's another prediction for you. it will become harder and harder for indie developers to make inroads with large content creators who will be ever more tightly connected with the industry. This will increase the importance of smaller creators, including those working in narrow niches and in non-English markets, particularly Chinese, Korean, and Spanish. In retrospect, it's embarrassing I left off Portuguese. I work with, or somewhat work with, an individual, Vitor Costa, who is very significant in the Portuguese language space, but never mind, continuing with my prediction. Eventually, a loose network or networks of developers and creators will form, and working with this network will be key for new developers. That last part obviously didn't happen, but what about all the stuff before that? I should note that I wrote that back when it was before I started or restarted on YouTube, I guess, and also at a time when video game writing was still very much a sideline for me. It was not a major focus. I was kind of moving out of fiction, but at the same time I was trying a lot of different things, so I really wasn't thinking about how I would be pulled into it. Obviously, I'm a very, very, very small part of this. But this one I would actually defend, because when I look around, and I've mentioned in SOI that I spent, especially this year, spent a lot of time on game developer Reddit, which is kind of where all the activity is. Like, content creators on YouTube, Twitch, TikTok to a much lesser extent, they really aren't as reliable in terms of driving attention as they used to be, if they ever were at all. I think I've mentioned before that I think the whole Kingmaker thing was always overhyped, but at this point, they are the best option for small developers, only in that for most developers, they're the only option. Other than sometimes PC Gamer. PC Gamer's indie coverage is actually not bad. Most of these other websites are terrible at it. They only talk about the famous ones, 8, 10, 12 games a year. Everyone else gets ignored. Advertising is hit or miss. I know a lot of people swear by Reddit ads. That seems to work for some people. I'm sure it doesn't work for everyone. But for most people, talking to people on YouTube and Twitch is your promotion. And it's really the only option you have. There is always a barrier. There's always a language barrier. You do want to reach out to people in these other large, emergent, growing markets. It's kind of tricky, but you cross your fingers and hope that like some pack of Chinese streamers you've never even heard of picks up on your game, which does happen to some people. The impetus for that prediction in the first place was that year I talked to someone from Megacrit. Slay the Spire tripped out of the gate, and then it was kind of revived by China. Very famous example of an overseas market uplifting one of these games. But insofar as I got this one, I think it's more of a comment toward journalists, pundits, whatever you want to call them. There is a tendency for English language speakers to focus on the Anglosphere because it is easy, but you're missing so much of it. Like if you talk about YouTube, just to bring it back around to where I'm posting this, if you talk about YouTube, so many commentators will only talk about English language channels, even though if you look at the top 100, many of the largest are Spanish. The largest growing ones are Spanish. Obviously, many of the largest music videos, are either Spanish language or by Spanish artists. So I think we ignore these non-Anglo markets at our own peril. It's just important to track them. Yeah, I know it's difficult if you're monolingual, but it's important. It matters. Another prediction incoming, and this one's another maybe where I will defend this even though I know it wasn't exactly correct. Increasingly, AAA companies will spin off teams into quasi-independent studios as they continue to experiment with smaller, less labor-intensive games that can be produced quickly at a predictable profit. This experiment will also include an acceleration in these large companies buying out smaller dev teams, with the most desirable teams being those producing games that have proven console appeal, such as platformers and arcade-style games. Mercy was I hoping that like conventional platformers would come back. They obviously haven't, other than Metroidvanias, which are kind of their own thing. But as to the rest of it, I mean, kind of. Some of them have. When you look at the companies that are doing this, it's mostly like legacy AAA companies that are maybe not the biggest. Even within the AAA space, you do have a hierarchy because you have, at the top you have companies like Rockstar that are an EA and these other giants. And then at the bottom, you've got companies like Capcom. Capcom's really big. And for people my age, they're really important. But Capcom is not as big as you think. Square Enix is not as big as you think. Konami is probably bigger than you think given their reputation, but not as big as they could be. These older companies are relatively small, and these are the ones who are using more of their sort of nostalgia factor with their older IPs, doing remakes and re-releases and things of that nature, and it's worked out well for them. Probably the most on point that I hit with this prediction was a company that I sure as shit wasn't thinking of, which is Nexon. Nexon, of course, spun off Mint Rocket, which gave us Dave the Diver, which people are convinced is an indie game, even though it was technically made by a gigantic company. You can obviously see why I would make a prediction like this at the time. I was kind of thinking, specifically at the time, I was thinking Disney when I was growing up. When I was growing up, we were in the middle of the Disney Renaissance. They were releasing these, gigantic, we had Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King and all of these giant films. But in between, Disney was also putting out a lot of these, what back then they called family films, which were live action, were generally relatively cheap. They wouldn't make that much money, but they didn't cost that much money, so they were a safe bet. And I had a feeling that as AAA games, were getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time, or becoming riskier, that these companies would hedge their bets with smaller games. And some of them have been doing it. Some of them have also been farming this workout, especially in the ones who are experimenting with the mobile market. But in terms of them properly entering the indie space or buying out companies, that hasn't really happened. So you could pretty comfortably say that this prediction was wrong in that point and right in others. It's kind of a mixed. I'm not going to defend it too much, but I think it is at least a defensible prediction. I'm going to throw out one more, and this is another one that's kind of in the genres, wishful thinking on my part kind of area, but again, I feel it's at least a little bit defensible. The games that are currently popular will remain on top. However, as low-cost systems, including portable gaming PCs and microconsoles, continue to grow their presence in the market, there will be an increased interest in traditional game genres. Obviously hasn't really happened, but continuing. To remain competitive in this growing space, developers will have to experiment with new features and attractions, spawning a generation of platformers and adventure games. Once again, this is me really wanting those adventure games to come back. But a generation of platformers and adventure games with novel mechanics, deeper storytelling, and wholly new graphic styles. Kinda hitting 1 for 3 on that last point. The novel graphic styles actually is happening, but not for the reason that I thought. It's happening because of the increased importance of short form, and you need to have a style that's very attention-grabbing right off the jump. So that is driving more interest in these kind of more visually distinctive games. The other 3, not even close. And in fact, especially the deeper storytelling thing, really does not work in short form. One of my developers, I think it was the guy from Trace Brothers, mentioned that, so much of this is these like clippable games are kind of what moves, because that's just our current media environment is your ability to take these little pieces of something and distribute those broadly. So when you look at things like strategy games, adventure games, many types of RPGs, puzzle games, they don't work as well because they're not that visually grasping. They don't really arrest you. They don't grab your attention when you're flicking through your feed really quick. And that is why you need these graphical styles. And unfortunately, that is meaning that a lot of those traditional genres probably aren't going to come back because they're not as visually distinctive. They're not as dynamic. They're not going to be clippable. They're not going to stand out in an animated GIF. They're just not as easy to depict in a really short period of time. And that is something that's really challenging a lot of developers. But yeah, once again, you can see in these predictions I was making in 2021 and 22, I was maybe sort of hoping that some of these genres would come back. They were pipe dreams. It was never going to happen, right? So in terms of like platformers coming back, I mean, Metroidvanias, if you want to count them, but that's not what I was thinking when I said that. And I don't remember exactly what year this was, but I was not thinking of Metroidvanias or whatever the current popular thing is. Thus ends my look back through the cracked crystal ball. If you want to look through, I invite you to look through these posts and find anything else I might have said that is either on point or way off the mark. Go ahead and leave it in the comments. This is one of those rare situations where I would actually kind of love to hear you giving me shit. But until next time, see you.